Hi, thanks very much for the introduction. As it's mentioned, my name is Mohammed Mustafa. I am a Microsoft MVP, and I'm really excited to be here to talk about GDPR. It's a subject that is very exciting to some, maybe not very exciting to others, but I think it's certainly interesting to a lot of people around the world. Many organizations and many businesses are thinking and considering how does GDPR impact them. So today we're going to talk about this for a bit. We're also going to talk about Microsoft Dynamics. Today is one of two webinars where we will be talking about this whole subject around GDPR and Microsoft Dynamics 365. So if we talk about today's agenda, we'll be talking about GDPR basics, an introduction into GDPR, what it is and what it means. Hopefully some of you have already heard a lot about GDPR. Some of you might not have. So if you haven't heard a lot about GDPR, hopefully the first few slides will help you to get up to speed on what it is and how it impacts you. We'll also talk about GDPR requirements and some of the myths that sit around GDPR. We'll discuss its impact on your organization and all organizations, as well as we're going to discuss how Microsoft is getting ready for GDPR and all the work that's happening behind the scenes to make sure that Microsoft partners and Microsoft customers are ready for GDPR as well. We close today's webinar by talking about the cloud deployments and its impact and GDPR impact on cloud deployments. We'll also talk about on-premise deployments and whether GDPR differentiates between the two. But first, I want to make a big disclaimer, really, that there is no warranty included in this webinar. I am certainly not a solicitor or a lawyer, so hence today's discussion is more about trying to understand together what is GDPR and how to impact us, but by no means this is a legal advice that you can use. I'll also try to provide a balanced argument. I don't think there is a simple answer. As you know, GDPR, or as you might know, GDPR is not effective yet, so there isn't any tested cases to confirm one way or the other. And finally, please make sure that this is not taken as a full exhaustive list of all considerations for GDPR. So let's jump into definition. GDPR stands for General Data Protection Regulation. It's a regulation by the EU Parliament, Council and Commission, and it aims to strengthen and unify data protection across the whole of the EU and every single member state. It applies on data related to all individuals who are resident within the European Union. And this is very important because many organizations who are incorporated outside of the EU, they might think that GDPR doesn't apply to them, and this is not correct. GDPR applies to your organization as long as you literally touch EU individuals or EU residents' data. If you control this data, if you access this data, if you process this data, GDPR applies to you. And we'll talk more about that. It also addresses the export of personal data outside the EU. So not just the data that is stored inside the EU, but if there is an EU organization that for some reason wants to export some of the personal data outside the EU for whatever service they would like to offer. The EU Commission really summarizes the GDPR objectives into two main objectives. Number one, this is all about giving EU residents and citizens, giving them back control over their own personal data. It has been many years since EU residents didn't really feel that they own their data. And GDPR is about giving them back this control. The second objective is to simplify regulatory environments. And I have to put simplify between double quotes because I don't think anyone would agree that the word GDPR and simplicity can come in the same sentence. Many people would disagree. But hear me out. The GDPR objective here is to simplify the regulatory environment for international business. So if you are an international organization who are delivering services to EU residents and EU citizens, you will find that there is a different Data Protection Act and different data protection regulation in each EU member state different from the other member state. So you as an organization, as an international organization, you have to cater for every data protection act in each EU member state. But by having one single regulatory environment for data protection across all EU member states makes your organization life simpler. And in a way, it encourages organizations to deal with the EU because they know they only got one set, possibly very complex, but still one set of clearly defined regulations they have to follow. What is really important is that GDPR now applies to both data controllers and data processors. So a data controller here is anyone who captures the data, and the data processor is anyone who processes this data on behalf of the data controller. We're going to go through the definitions in a moment, but it's very important that what GDPR brings is that it adds this layer of legal obligation on data processors. Up until now, a data processor, an organization which just processes the data, it doesn't capture the data or store the data themselves, but they have access to the data and they process this data, they are currently under no legal obligation directly. So they cannot be targeted by the EU Data Commissioner directly. It's only the data controller that currently is under legal obligation in front of the EU Commissioner. But GDPR changes that. GDPR brings in a significant increase in legal obligation on the processors so that they are both equally expected to be compliant with GDPR. Very importantly, that GDPR is going to be effective on the 25th of May 2018. But that doesn't mean you can start getting compliant on the 25th of May. This is really about making sure you are compliant and ready by May 2018. So don't wait until that date. You actually have to start working now. And if you haven't already, the GDPR investigations will start on the 25th of May. So you have to be ready from now. So let's move into talking a bit about impact. How does GDPR impact you as an organization? We discussed how it's a legal obligation, which lies with both data controllers and processors now. But it brings in a number of new legal requirements for every organization. This includes mandatory reporting. Organizations don't currently have mandatory reporting requirements as part of data protection acts across the EU. They might have certain statutory reporting that they have to deliver for specific reasons because of the type of their organization or the incorporation of their organization, but it doesn't apply in every single organization. This has now changed. Now you have mandatory reporting, and you are obliged by law to continuously monitor your data and your systems to make sure there is no data breaches. If there is a data breach, then again, you have to report that within 24 hours of learning about the data breach. Organizations now have to have a very solid and rigorous governance processes to make sure that they are continuously monitoring and have notifications about any possible breaches so that they notify their local EU data commissioner within 24 hours of being informed about a breach. And the biggest challenge for all organizations is the penalty fines. If organizations are found to be in breach, they could pay up to 20 million euros, and that's not a small amount for a small organization, or 4% of a global annual turnover in the preceding financial year for other organizations, whichever is greater. So if you think about large multinational global organizations, 4% of global annual turnover. I was recently in a session with Microsoft, and we were talking about GDPR, and we were joking, although it's true, that if Microsoft were to be fined by GDPR, that's about $4 billion fine. So the 20 million comes across as a very small amount in this case. But for smaller businesses with turnover of 1 million or 2 million, a 20 million euro fine could literally get them out of business. So you can see that the EU Commission is really serious about GDPR. It's really serious about giving EU citizens control. There are two-tier penalty regimes, so the fines are actually half this amount in certain types of breaches, but I think organizations in generality, they all have to work towards compliance regardless of how much the fines could potentially be. So let's talk a bit about the 6 main things that you can take away about GDPR. Number 1, it's a complete data protection game changer. It applies to every organization in the world. If you think about in the current context, in the current environment, an organization sitting outside the EU has no legal obligation towards the EU for any EU resident data they capture. We've all heard about the recent hacks and data breaches that happened in some of the large organizations, global organizations, which were not resident in the EU. They were not targeted directly by the EU Commissioner for fines and so on because the lack of this regulation. So it's a massive data protection game changer for everyone and for any organization that literally touches EU data. It applies equally on all EU member states, and we discussed that. Now there's no longer a local interpretation of data protection. The data protection of GDPR applies equally on all member states, and hence the same fines will apply regardless of where the data breach has happened. It's got massive fines, so it really has got teeth. And as we mentioned, fines could literally bring businesses out of business, excuse the pun, but it will make some businesses go bust. The other really fundamental challenge with GDPR is that it's encouraging organizations to follow a risk-based approach to all their IT systems and all their IT strategies and product development. Because if you think around a CRM context, a CRM system context, CRM, customer relationship management, is all about understanding your customer. We all have heard about the term KYC, know your customer. So it's all about understanding your customers. In some situations, you have organizations who know everything about their customers, from the football team they support to what holiday they go to what perfume their wives like to have. So there are a lot of organizations who take their relationship with customers seriously, and it's all for the sake of either providing a better customer service, or it could be for better targeted marketing campaigns. So they want to target their marketing campaigns to exactly the customers that would be interested, as well as providing better sales experience and better sales offers for their customers based on what they already know about them. This is now changing. GDPR is shifting that focus from being a completely open system as a CRM system into a more risk-based system, where organizations should now start to think, which data are we capturing and why we're capturing this? Where it is being captured and who can access it? Do we have consent and permission to capture this data? And so on and so forth. So there's a lot of additional risks that GDPR brings and makes organizations start thinking about risk. It's also about making organizations accountable. We discussed how data processors used to have less obligations or no obligations in some instances towards the EU Commission when there are data breaches. And it was always the data controllers who were on the hook, really. But this is now changing. It's making every organization accountable, regardless of the size. So it could be that an individual consultant incorporated as a limited company, they could get hit by GDPR if they were the cause of data breach and they were seen to be not compliant at the time of the breach. So that also pushes data controllers and data processors into taking more actions to prove that they are compliant. Because GDPR is also about making sure you've got evidence and proofs that you have done everything you can to prevent any possible data breaches. While there still might be some fines if there was a data breach, but an organization that have taken a lot of steps and a lot of actions to make sure there are no data breaches, and still a data breach happened, they will be treated completely different from an organization who did nothing or who couldn't prove that they worked on providing the governance, the structure, the monitoring, and the reporting to ensure there are no data breaches. Finally, what is really important about GDPR to remember is that many people would see this as a long overdue regulation. We've seen some of the largest corporations globally being hacked, their data being compromised, EU residents' data being sold, identity thefts, and lots of sad stories about EU residents' data, and obviously global, global human data that has been sold and hacked and stolen and so on. So the EU here is trying to bring back that control, bring back that regulation. And it's interesting to know that the EU only started to apply some data protection back in the 1990s. So since the 1990s, there haven't been any fundamental laws or regulations added specifically for data protection, which in turn, if you think about it, brings the point that GDPR is almost overdue. And with how the information technology, the computer and technology industries have moved on since the 90s, it's really time to bring some control over that. If we move on to some of the myths that people have about GDPR, and it's very interesting because until today, when I do a session, a webinar, or I meet customers or other consultants, these myths exist in many organizations and with many individuals. And it's fair to say GDPR as a concept is fairly new, so not many organizations would have the full understanding. But it's important to understand that these are incorrect statements so that you avoid falling into the trap of GDPR compliance or becoming not compliant with GDPR. So the first myth that many organizations say, oh, I'm just a small or medium business. I'm a small business. This regulation doesn't really apply to me. This is false, incorrect. As I mentioned, GDPR applies to any incorporated body. So if you are a small limited liability company, even if you only have one employee, you still are under GDPR compliance and you are required to be in compliance with GDPR. The other element or the other myth that I heard a lot is that GDPR is all about data security. That is far from true. GDPR is definitely about data security, but it's not just about data security at rest. It's about data security for when it comes to data transfer. But not only that, it's also about consumer rights. GDPR gives consumers 6 fundamental rights that they don't currently have. So to think that just having robust security measures and some data encryption is enough for you to be compliant, this is not true. You must have processes and you must have governance to prove that you are compliant. And we'll talk about that later. The other myth is that fines are significant. However, we don't expect that the EU Commissioner will really make all these, these heavy fines, or that there is likely to be multiple warnings before the fines. Again, this is false. There is nothing to say that this is going to be the case. If anything, it sounds like the EU Data Commissioner is gearing up to start investigations the day GDPR becomes effective. And we talked about how customers or organizations who have European customers exist, and organizations who are incorporated outside the EU are still within the GDPR compliance. I'll repeat that. Cut. 3, 2, 1. We've also discussed how European customers' data captured within systems and IT solutions and IT systems by other organizations who are incorporated outside the EU, they still fall within the GDPR coverage. So GDPR covers your organization whether or not you are located in or out of EU, as long as you process or you control EU residence data. As we said, it's enforced on the 25th of May, which means you have to be ready before the 25th of May, so that if there is an investigation, and if you are one of the lucky ones who get investigated on the first day of GDPR, you are already ready for it. This whole idea of I am just a data processor, I am not a data controller, I don't control or store the data, is also a false myth. It's a myth. GDPR applies to you whether or not you're a processor or controller, either of them. So let's talk a bit about the key personas and definitions and concepts of GDPR. We've got data subjects. These are the EU residents, the EU individuals, which their data are being processed or controlled. So they are a natural person, and they are the ones who make data subject requests. So data subject requests include requests to access, port, correct, erase, or restrict processing of their own personal data. Any EU resident, they have the right to call their service provider or any organization that captured their data, and ask them for every shred of information they have about them. And this is called the data subject request, the data access request, in which case organizations are obliged to provide all this information. They can also call up their service provider or the organization that captures the data and ask them to port their data from one vendor to the other, correct the information they carry or capture about them, erase it completely, which is also known as the right to be forgotten, or restrict certain elements of their personal data from being processed. So, for example, some sensitive information about an individual, if you capture this about an EU individual, they have the right to call you, contact you, email you, and say, do not process or capture or erase this part of my information. This could be sexuality, ethnicity, religion, or any other part of data that you might not particularly want to use for your day-to-day business activities as an organization, but the EU resident doesn't feel comfortable with your organization capturing or storing this data. So you, as a data controller, you are the one who determine how the data is being processed. In a Microsoft Dynamics 365 environment, this is the tenant of an Office 365 or a Microsoft Dynamics 365 tenancy. They are the controllers, i.e. they manage the customer-facing application, and they are the ones who capture and store the data. They map this data, and they are the ones who allow data processors to process their customers' data on their behalf, which is the data processor. So in the case of Microsoft here, for example, Microsoft is in fact the data processor, because you as a customer, you are controlling the data of your customers. So let's say you are a bank and you are controlling or storing or managing your customers' data. Microsoft is in the cloud hosting this information for you, so they are your data processor. They only act upon your direct instructions of how to process this data. C1s are usually your primary customers, and C2s are your customers' customers, and so on. So I'm not going to go through this in detail, but the GDPR compliance requirements, they go through a lot of things. We discussed how you have to have data security at rest as well as data transfers. You need to have regular impact assessments to make sure that your organization, your processes, your data controls are sound and they're still providing the enough security for your customers' data. You have to implement in every design, in every solution, in every component of your IT systems, you have to implement the principles and safeguards of data protection. For example, data minimization. You should only capture the data that you require. Another example is data encryption or anonymization of your customers' data in certain instances where you don't need to capture the data or where the customer hasn't given you consent to capture this data. You also have to make sure that you are complying with your own data retention policies. So if the customer consent to you is to capture the data for 12 months, after 12 months you can no longer capture this data or continue to store this data without a new consent. If the consent expires, you have to remove this data and completely delete it from your systems. And we talked about the reporting and regulatory requirements around reporting breaches, as well as making sure that you've got all the governance processes in place. So if I were to summarize, how can GDPR compliance be achieved in 6 simple, or maybe not simple, but 6 straightforward steps for any organization? I would say you start number 1 by cleansing your data. Review all your current databases and make sure that you are not capturing data that you do not need for your day-to-day business activities. You're not capturing data that are not accurate or that are not relevant. Then you have to go and map this data. Make sure that every field of information, every piece of information you capture about your customers have a reason why you capture them, and you know where they are stored and who can access them. This kind of data mapping is very important, and it's also very helpful when it comes to data breach investigations. You will then, as an organization, need to go and update your privacy policies, make sure that all your forms, or whether they are digital web forms or they are actually handwritten forms, any type of forms or data capture processes, you have the privacy policies clear and that your customers are understanding and giving consent for this information. Which leads us to the 4th point, which is the re-permission. If you already capture some of your customers' data today, having this data existing doesn't exempt you from requiring a consent. So what you will need to do as an organization is you have to go and re-permission, get a new permission, a new consent from your customers to make sure that they understand why their data is captured, what type of data is captured, and for how long. You need to track this whole consent management processes to make sure that all your consents are active. If they expire, you renew them ahead of expiry dates. And if you cannot renew them, you are wiping out customers' data. And then you have to run an audit, a regular audit impact assessment across all these steps and across all your systems. And a one impact assessment will never be enough. It needs to be regular. You need to have regular monitoring and a structured governance process and reporting. With that, let's talk a bit about Microsoft and what Microsoft is trying to do to make sure they themselves are GDPR compliant, but also to make sure that Microsoft are helping their customers and their partners to be GDPR compliant. It's important to understand that behind the scenes, Microsoft is really doing a lot of hard work to achieve GDPR compliance. I have personally been in lots of discussions and meetings and webinars, as well as live sessions with Microsoft teams who are all thinking about GDPR. In fact, one of the Microsoft product development teams were telling me that every member of their team has to remember GDPR at least once a day, because they know that every process and every functionality and every feature they're building, it has to be compliant with GDPR. So while you might think that Microsoft is considering GDPR as an EU-specific regulation that might not impact them directly that much, that's not the case. Microsoft is really taking this seriously. Microsoft has announced that they are committed to be compliant across every cloud service they have by the time the enforcement begins on the 25th of May. You can see more details on the microsoft.com/GDPR. But what is really interesting is Microsoft have financially backed this contractual commitment that they've made upon themselves. It not only covers the productivity cloud solutions, but it also covers all the business solutions. So Microsoft Dynamics 365, CRM, customer engagement, ERPs, as well as Office 365, the whole of Microsoft 365 really, and anything in Microsoft Cloud is covered by this commitment. In regards to Dynamics 365, it currently already complies with a lot of regulations, but the teams behind the scene who are working on Microsoft Dynamics, and there are lots of them, they are all taking into account all these GDPR compliance and regulations and limitations that they are embedding inside the product at the moment. So there might be a release in the next few months where Microsoft actually embeds additional features that are specific for GDPR into their Dynamics 365. So watch this space, but be sure that there is a lot of work that's happening behind the scenes to make sure that all Microsoft Cloud technologies are compliant. If we focus specifically on Dynamics 365, there are a lot of built-in security and compliance features that I have personally used to make sure that Microsoft Dynamics 365 solutions are compliant. So I have a number of customers at the moment who are Dynamics 365 customers. Some of them already have a Microsoft Dynamics CRM system, but they are trying to upgrade, enhance, expand on their current features and functionalities to make sure that all their processes are GDPR compliant. And there are a lot of features and built-in functionality that we managed to use to make sure that our solution is compliant. I'm going to talk a lot more about this in the next webinar, but I'll give you a flavor of some of these features today. Some of the features that you would expect, but in case you're not aware, is the whole Azure Active Directory and Identity and Access Management is used across Microsoft Dynamics 365. So everything around identity and access management in Dynamics 365 is using the same Azure AD, which you might be already using with some of your cloud functionality, or you might be considering for your cloud solutions. Dynamics 365 is automatically, for production environments, is automatically encrypted at rest. And also when transfers happen between user devices and data centers. And as I mentioned, there is an array of additional capabilities to be released soon. And every production environment has a number of monitoring and protections, which I just listed a few of them. These include firewalls, IP filtering, penetration testing, regular penetration testing, the DDoS attack preventions, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of protection that Microsoft already has in place for Dynamics 365. But there are more and more features and capabilities being added. Remember this when we come to the point of talking about cloud versus on-premise. But also remember that when you're selecting Microsoft Dynamics 365, you're not just selecting Dynamics 365 as a solution, you're selecting the whole Microsoft Cloud ecosystem. And this is just an example of some of the additional features and functionality and security measures that are available across the whole Microsoft Azure ecosystem. Between Key Vaults, Security Center, App Security, Data Classification, e-discovery, Data Loss Prevention, Threat Intelligence, Audit Logs, the list is huge. There are a lot of features and functionalities that you can use outside of Dynamics 365 that help you become compliant. So as you can see, it's not just Microsoft Dynamics 365. When you subscribe to Dynamics 365, you're actually getting the full Microsoft Azure technologies and all the securities and apps that come with it. With that, I want to go slightly into the details of what you as a data controller, as a Microsoft customer, have access to and what Microsoft is doing on your behalf. So the data controller, as you can see here, they are the tenant admin of the Dynamics 365 cloud service. They determine how the data is processed. They also are the ones who manage the C1 and C2. So as we define, the C1 is your organization's customers, and C2s are your customers' customers, and so on. So they decide, by having access as a system administrator, as a tenant admin, they've got full control of who can access what parts of the data and which information is being captured, which information has consent, and whether the consent is valid or not, and so on. So it covers the whole data control area. Dynamics 365 gives you that ability in its cloud services. And we're using an example here where Microsoft is only the processor. Well, I say only, but they are legally obliged to only process the data as you allow them to. So you can have your own encryption keys. You can instruct Microsoft to deliver certain access requests or certain subject requests, such as what we discussed around the data access or subject access requests or subject correction requests and so on. And Microsoft, on your behalf, manages the telemetry data as well as the tenant database, but all under your construction. So if you move on to how Microsoft sees this, in the cloud services, they run the whole backend of the cloud service. So you as a Microsoft customer, you do not have to worry about the backend because it's Microsoft's responsibility. They are committed contractually to manage this in accordance to your instructions. However, there are special cases where Microsoft is also a controller, i.e. they have access to specific data. And that's, for example, is around the support data or the administration data, who logged into the system and at one point. So this is only a special case in this environment, but this special case means that Microsoft does know who accessed the data at what point. They might have some audit information. They might have some additional data that they capture for fulfillment purposes or for telemetry data and so on. This data is linkable to a user and their actions, and then accordingly it becomes a person's personal data because it can be linked back to a customer or can be linked back to a user. So what Microsoft is saying here is that they are planning to anonymize and delink all their telemetry data in Microsoft Dynamics servers in the cloud. And they will fulfill on your behalf any data subject requests for telemetry data for your customer or C1s. So that really gives you the power to control your own data, but not only that, use Microsoft to deliver data subject requests for the telemetry data that Microsoft captures on your behalf. Let's think a bit about whether going into the cloud is actually more or less risky for you as an organization to be GDPR compliant. I'm sure, and I have seen many organizations thinking, how does this whole saga around GDPR going to affect my cloud decision? Should I go cloud? Should I stay on premise? Is it more secure if I stay on premise? Am I more compliant if I am on premise? The simple answer in my view is that GDPR applies in both cases. So whether you're on premise or you're in the cloud, you still have to have the processes, the structure, the governance structure for GDPR. You have to be compliant whether or not you're in the cloud or on premise. So the other factor that you have to take into account is that it goes back into the data center where your data is being stored. If you're using your own data center, then all the governance and monitoring processes that you will apply at the business solution will also need to be replicated around the hardware access. So for example, you will need to know and you need to measure and keep track of every single individual who access your data center. What they can go, when do they go in, when do they go out, what data they have access to and what data they don't have access to. If your customers asks you who can access our data physically, who can actually log in on our databases or see or even touch our hardware, you as a data center, as an organization with its own data center, you are obliged to provide all this information. But if you're using Microsoft Cloud, then Microsoft is taking all these responsibilities on your behalf. You are still responsible to have the processes, the governance, the monitoring on your business solution. But they are responsible for everything that happens on the back end, everything that happens in the cloud. Who access the data center, who access the hardware, who can see the data and who can't. And for example, applying encryption, who have got access to the encryption key and who can't. So Microsoft Dynamics 365, for example, they apply encryption on your data at rest, which means no one, not even Microsoft, can access your data inside their data center. Can you do the same thing inside your data center? That's a question that you have to ask yourself. If you as an organization have got the investment and the interest to have all these kind of compliance and regulatory requirements inside your data center. You have to take into account every physical and virtual access. You have to take into account enterprise mobility and security. You have to take into account how you're integrating the various solutions. So again, is there a simple answer? I think GDPR applies to both. You need to be compliant regardless. You need to have the processes, the governance, and the structure regardless. But if you have your data in a Microsoft cloud, then Microsoft does on your behalf a lot of the back-end data security, leaving to you just the responsibility of making sure that the business solution is compliant. Next webinar, we will be talking about 3 key areas around GDPR compliance, and specifically within the context of Microsoft Dynamics 365. Number 1, we will talk about consumer rights. We talked about subject access requests, right to be forgotten, data portability, but we'll also talk about how we can apply these areas inside Microsoft Dynamics 365. What features and built-in capabilities that you can use to provide these services to your customers. For example, if a customer calls you and says, I would like a full access details of subject access request where you give me every single shred of information you capture about me in all your IT solutions or IT systems. How can you extract this data out of your Microsoft Dynamics solution? We'll talk about some of the features that we have. We'll also talk about the classification of data. You have different ways to classify customer data. There is the personal identifiable information, the PI term, which is becoming very common term now to define what data you can, what fields and what shreds or pieces of information that can be used to identify a customer. Anything that you can identify a customer with is a PI. How can you capture only the PI information that are essential for your business, avoid capturing the ones that are non-essential, and the ones which are PI as well as being sensitive data, how are you going to secure this data? We'll also talk about how you can set up consents, ensure that you've got a business process to obtain, maintain, renew, validate, invalidate consents, and make sure that you can always allow the customer to withdraw their consents. Additionally, we're going to discuss the governance and continuous monitoring and the statutory reporting that GDPR expects you to do. Just to give you a taste of what we will be discussing, you will see on the slides here, we're going to be talking about relevance search to deliver subject access requests. We'll talk about using multiple forms, field level security, business units, user-owned records in Dynamics 365. We'll also cover everything around data access and security, including data encryption and how you can have your own data encryption keys on your Microsoft Dynamics 365, which means no one else can access your data, not even someone who got a physical access to your hard disk. They cannot access your data if you create your own encryption key and you store it. We'll talk about all the audit management functionalities and how this comes out of the box in Dynamics 365. Here is a list of some of the resources that you can refer to understand and learn more about Microsoft and Microsoft's efforts to make sure that their customers and their partners are GDPR ready. I strongly suggest that you start by going to the Trust Center. There is also a dedicated section under microsoft.com/GDPR. There is a dedicated section within the Trust Center for Dynamics 365, which also covers GDPR. But not only that, Microsoft have created a number of GDPR demos within Microsoft GDPRdemos.com location, where you can go and see some demos and some user stories of how GDPR can apply to you. You can also have a look at my blog, where I've got some information and some posts detailing some of the features and capabilities that Dynamics 365 gives us to make sure that our solutions are ready. With that, I would like to summarize what we discussed today. While GDPR is a compliance threat to many of us, it also should be regarded as an opportunity to improve organizations' internal IT systems and also to give citizens and residents the rights of their data and access to the data back. It impacts every organization, whether or not they are in the EU, and as an organization you should always be ensuring that you have the evidence that shows your compliance activities, your system upgrades, your continuous governance and assessments as required. There are significant fines for data breaches, but Microsoft is committed to support all their customers and partners to ensure they are ready for GDPR. And with that, I leave you with my contact details. If you would like to discuss more, by all means, please reach out. You can go to my blog, you can connect to me on LinkedIn, follow me on Twitter, or any other way. It is becoming a very interesting subject, GDPR, for many people. So if you want to have a chat or a discussion about it, by all means, please get in touch. Thanks very much.